Hello, my name is Ian Beabout, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we will be taking a look at the 11th Jethro Tull studio album. This is 1978's Heavy Horses, the third album to feature the stable late 70s lineup, that being Ian Anderson on vocals, flute, acoustic guitar, as well as songwriting, Martin Barre on electric guitar, John Glasscock on bass, Barry Barlow on drums, and of course, John Evan and Dee Palmer on keyboards, with Dee Palmer contributing heavily to the arrangements and orchestrations of this record, perhaps more so than ever. I do think that this album captures Tull at their absolute height, both commercially and artistically. This album also marks the beginning of the Maison Rouge Studios. This was a professional studio owned and operated by Ian Anderson that was actually rented out to other groups. And in the liner notes, which are excellent on this release, Ian Anderson talks about how difficult it was financially to keep that studio running. And part of that meant that Jethro Tull worked the hours that nobody else wanted to work because Maison Rouge was constantly servicing clients. And so what you have is Tull going in after hours, working until the early hours of the morning on this material. Ian Anderson and the band have greater opportunities than ever to be creative and to try out new things. I think that without the need to pay for an engineer and studio time, it afforded them a lot more flexibility in terms of what they could do. I'm going to talk briefly about the songs on this album, and then I'll also talk about Steven Wilson's remix as well as the extras, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there. We start off with a song called And the Mouse Police Never Sleeps, and this is dedicated to Ian Anderson's cats, a interesting, odd-metered track inspired by Captain Beefheart's Click Clack. I do like this portrait of Ian Anderson's cats, and this is a thread that I've always enjoyed, and I've always appreciated Anderson's philanthropy when it comes to cats. He's never hidden the fact that he adores those fine creatures. We have a track like Acres Wild. The interesting thing about this song to me is that it kind of has a disco beat, with Barry Barlow laying down some really cool hi-hat stuff. It's almost like a disco song, but it's at the wrong tempo. It's at like a folk jig tempo. And this has always been an album highlight for me. Next we have No Lullaby, which is Ian Anderson singing to his kids, specifically James, who was very young at the time of this album's recording. He may have only been a year or so old, and this is an example of a father reading stories to help soothe the child to sleep, and kind of hiding the horrors of the world, which are just around the corner. And I've always liked this song. However, I will say that I like it better live. There is something lacking in the studio version to me. It's like a little bit pulled back tempo-wise, and it doesn't quite have the same bluesy feel that I like about the live versions. But I still enjoy the studio cut. And there's some really interesting, especially when you listen to the surround mix, there's some really interesting drum overdubs. And I'm convinced, even though I have no proof of this, I'm convinced that Barry Barlow double-tracked some of those awesome tom rolls that occur in the introduction of this track. So we move on to Moths, which is another disc highlight for me. It's this very upbeat and, again, folky song that deals with the love of two moths and a flame. And it's like this self-destructive love song. the type of which is, I guess, written often. There's a lot of that sort of thing. If you look at other bands and other songwriters from over the years, two people fall in love and it is the end of them. It's their destruction. So next we have Journeyman. This song deals with another common Jethro Tull theme, which is travel, specifically on trains. We see this in a track like Locomotive Breath. We see this theme crop up again on the War Child album, when Two Fingers has a little bit of this train song thing. And even a little bit later on with a song like Inverness Sleeper from the Broadsword and the Beast sessions, or Trains, Ian Anderson's solo album, Walk Into Light. This is a very odd song, and it's a John Glasscock feature. The bass is very much at the forefront of this track, and I noticed when listening to it that it seemed like maybe in spots the bass was multi-tracked. Again, I don't have any confirmation on that. I don't know. I can just go by what I hear, but it sounds like there might be some clever overdubbing. With the song Rover, we again return to this animals theme, farm creatures. This was written for Ian Anderson's dog, who also appears on the front cover of Songs from the Wood. It's also a song that could be taken as a metaphor for touring, because it seems to be about somebody hitting the road and going on a journey and not quite knowing what lies ahead, but the journey being more important than perhaps the arrival point. Drifter's gonna drift, well, rover's gonna rove. So next we have One Brown Mouse. It sort of brings back to me a lot of Tull's early 70s writing. Songs like Bungle in the Jungle, or The Hare Who Lost His Spectacles. That theme of animals and people. Look at the animals, such as on the Chateau de Herville sessions. It's just a pretty little piece, and it's an opportunity for Barry Barlow to experiment with a lot of cool funk grooves. Barry Barlow is one of my Jethro Tull MVPs, and he always will be. I really like what he adds to this song in particular. Some nice forward momentum of the funk disco variety. It's pretty cool. It's almost like if Acres Wild is a disco beat up tempo, One Brown Mouse is like a disco beat down tempo. And I really dig that. So this album ends with my two favorite songs. The first one being Heavy Horses, which again sort of laments the end of the old ways, and things becoming more mechanized. There's also something that doesn't quite age about this track, and it is a classic Tull, if you'll pardon my pun, workhorse song, because there's a lot of multi-sections and there's a lot of acoustic passages with no drums or very light percussion. There's a lot of examples of layering of vocals, which brings to mind the Songs from the Wood album, and especially that song, the title track, Songs from the Wood. And it allows especially Martin Barre to really shine tonally, not just like the technicality of what he's playing, but I think this is some of Martin Barre's most iconic guitar tones. Like you can hear that and you go, oh, that's Jethro Tull. And it does give the band the chance to go through a lot of different subsections and transitions and heightened emotional moments. And I would say this is my favorite song on the album, except that I like Weathercock a little bit better. And of course, Weathercock isn't quite as classic. It wasn't played live all that much, although there is a good version from the Broadsword and the Beast tour, coupled with Fire at Midnight. I like this song a lot, especially musically. And lyrically, I like the idea of, this is a bit of a troubled album. It's kind of the first signs of cracks within the optimism, we'll say, of Songs from the Wood, and perhaps even influenced by some of the uneasiness and upheaval that was beginning to happen within the band, specifically John Glasscock's health. Even though there is this kernel of darkness that runs through it, I do think that there's always a glimmer of hope and optimism that is more or less absent by the time you get to the next record, Stormwatch. But it's still here, and I like that. There's always this like romanticism that runs through it. And I don't mean like a love between two human beings, but a romanticism of the past. It's something that makes this album really beautiful. And I think perhaps it's a reason why it connects to people, because its melancholy is so beautiful. And there's a line in Rover like that: I'm simple in my sadness, I'm resourceful in remorse. And I feel like that line right there could probably sum up the Heavy Horses album better than anything I've said so far in this review. I want to talk a little bit about Steven Wilson's remix. I feel like when it comes to talking about these remixes, I'm repeating myself a lot, but that comes down to the fact that Wilson's work is extremely consistent. And I would argue that when Wilson entered the Tull realm, that was the beginning of Tull's records beginning to sound consistent. Up until that point, Tull's records did sound very different from one another. And, you could point to something like Songs from the Wood as being extremely well produced, and there was always this sense that Heavy Horses wasn't quite as well produced, at least to my ear. But I think what Wilson's remix has revealed is that it was indeed very well recorded. And much like War Child, it's one of the more textured Jethro Tull albums with tons of overdubs, most of which weren't really replicated live, which is interesting, especially since there's a live album to talk about from this era. But with this album, you get a lot of mandolin presence. You get a lot of violin from Darrell Way, which is something that Tull didn't experiment with prior to that too much, like a solo violin. Dee Palmer's orchestrations really fill out this sound. And especially in talking about the surround mix, you hear a lot of that stuff, a lot of those string sounds coming from the back. Now, there are a couple of examples where Wilson improved upon the album's sound quality beyond just remixing, namely Moths and Rover, both of which, up until this point, have had the incorrect speed. On all prior releases have been at the incorrect speed and pitch. And by going back to the multi-tracks, Wilson was able to present these two tracks in particular at their proper speed and pitch. So it was the first time we've ever heard it sound the way it was recorded. And I think that's great. I also think that his mix reveals a ton of detail and just little moments and little parts of the arrangements that were always there, but he brings it to the forefront, like a blanket has been lifted off of the mix, and now you can pick out all these little details. I also like that the strings on Rover have been restored. The original mix of the album did have the strings, I believe, and the 2003 remaster did not. And I remember being really confused by that in 2003 when that remaster came out. So it's nice to hear them back. And if you read the liner notes, I think they were always intended to be there. But Anderson always had this battle in his head of whether that was one thing too many, whether he made it too ornate, too overcomplicated. I rather like having them there, and I feel like seeing as it's multi-channel, I like the idea of including as much of the arrangement as possible because we can handle it. If it's spread around the room, it's not competing for frequencies in the same way as it would be if it were just a straight stereo mix. On to the extras. You have two versions of Living in These Hard Times, which is an interesting piece of music because it connects to Old Aces Die Hard, which means that it connects to Dark Ages on the Stormwatch record. Tull were working on some iteration of the song Dark Ages, starting back in the Songs from the Wood period, with Old Aces Die Hard. And there's a little bit of lyrics in Old Aces that is essentially the first verse of Living in These Hard Times. So I like seeing the growth. So we heard Old Aces Die Hard on the Songs from the Wood box set. Now we hear this. By the way, prior to this, there was only one version of Living in These Hard Times, and it came out on the 20th anniversary box set. But here we have two. They did one with strings and one without, and the version 2 is the one that was intended to be released. It was actually intended to be released on either a single or an EP, but got bumped at the last minute for Life's a Long Song for reasons that nobody can understand. It was always a song that didn't really connect with me that much. But hearing the one that I guess they intended to release definitely increased my opinion of this track. And it also picks up on, I think, kind of a hidden theme of these folk rock albums, and that's the political undercurrent. It's a thread that runs through outtakes from all of these sessions, starting with Old Aces Die Hard, but also a song like Working John, Working Joe fits into this very pro-labor, pro-working class sentiment. And yeah, you see it on Living in These Hard Times, and you also see it on the next track, Everything in Our Lives. What's interesting about this to me is that this theme that was bubbling up about the situation within the working class really does come to the forefront by the time of Stormwatch. And I'm guessing that it probably took a lot of people by surprise. I just find it really fascinating that these threads were already happening in tracks that were left off of the albums. And theoretically, you could build a fourth folk trilogy album out of the outtakes. And it could potentially even be a double record set. So we're now talking about 5 records instead of just 3. And this just amazes me. It amazes me the not only the quantity of output from this band at this time, but the quality of output impresses me. I would say that of all of the associated recordings, Horse Hoeing and Husbandry is perhaps the most fascinating to me because, again, in this case, there's actual musical content here that was reused in Dark Ages. As it stands, this song is unfinished. At least the presentation here is. So it's kind of hard to rate it as a song, but it's very strong. What is here is very strong. And it's also notable to me because at the time, Ian Anderson was trying to reconcile with the Jethro Tull name by actually writing a song based on the agriculturalist and inventor of the seed drill. Horse Hoeing and Husbandry is actually the title of Jethro Tull's book. So I like that. I like that they were trying to do something historical and to reference their namesake. Beltane is another track that I love. It was previously released, but it's nice to hear it here. There is some uncredited saxophone playing, which I suspect is the work of Dee Palmer because it's much too good to be Ian Anderson's saxophone. But this is almost a return to a lot of the themes, again, of the early 70s, the maypole and pagan rituals. I really wish that this one had been on an album. I think it deserved to be. There's also a hidden track called A Town in England, which is purportedly an early version of Made in England from the Walk into Light sessions. To me, it's a little bit too undercooked to really tell. I can't really even tell how it relates to the Walk into Light song. But good to have either way. You know, I'm of the opinion of just release it all and let us fans dig through it and figure out what works and what doesn't. You know, I don't mind having stuff that's half-baked as an extra, especially a hidden extra. So the last thing to talk about here is the Live in Berne, Switzerland, May 1978 concert, which is included as an extra. This is the only content on this box set that is not mixed by Steven Wilson, and I believe it shows. It was mixed by Jacko Jaksic, the lead singer and frontman of the final iteration of King Crimson. The reason why I wanted to touch upon this briefly is that when we covered Bursting Out, my friend Mike and my friend Jocko and I covered Bursting Out. I had a lot of comments still not quite getting it, that Bursting Out and Berne are not the same thing and that they are quite different. I think it's worthwhile to have both, Live in Berne 1978 as well as the Bursting Out album, and here's why. The Bursting Out album was something that was carefully constructed by Ian Anderson. He chose performances which he believed best showcased these songs. I have to say, for the most part, I agree with his choices. I think he chose the right performances, and I think that in a lot of cases, he probably made the right choice to overdub things. There's some problems with out-of-tune instruments at times. I also think some of the performances aren't quite as good as the Bursting Out album. I think that the primary difference here is that this is warts and all. This is with all the mistakes left in, with all the banter left in, and it's an excellent representation, a fly-on-the-wall representation of Tull live, that I think is really worthwhile and I'm glad to have. However, the actual mix of it, I feel, is not nearly as good as what Steven Wilson was able to do with the Bursting Out album. And this is particularly applicable in surround sound, where it seems like there's barely any rear channel activity at all to my ears in the Jacko Jaksic mix. And that's fine. There is the sense that Tull are in front of you on stage, and if you're stereo only, this won't matter to you that much. However, I think that Steven Wilson did a much better job of making the Bursting Out album seem immersive and, more importantly, like a album in its own right. So I think depending on my mood, I might reach for Bursting Out over Live in Berne, simply because it is prepared. It is something that represents the composer's intent, which is really important to me. However, if I am in the mood to listen to a show that is naturalistic and raw, I'm happy to play Live in Berne, and the mix is fine. It's good enough. I just think that Steven Wilson's mix on Bursting Out is a whole lot better. It's a better experience for me. If you are able to, this has just been reissued. It appears you can't get these in America anywhere. You do have to import them from Burning Shed. Once again, the albums being reissued are Stand Up, War Child, A Passion Play, and Heavy Horses. All right, I think that wraps up just about everything I want to say about this great Jethro Tull album. It's top of the heap, top 5 easily Tull record. And if you have even the slightest interest in Tull, I think it's one of the essential purchases and essential listens. So yeah, don't forget that if you enjoyed this video, to leave a comment telling me what your reaction is. Do you intend to pick it up? How do you rank Heavy Horses? Is it your favorite? Let me know below in the comments. Also, don't forget to like the video, and if you would like to hear more from me in the future, please subscribe. After doing 3 or 4 Tull videos in a row, I might take a break on covering Jethro Tull. My next planned video is to do a King Crimson ranking, in which I will discuss all of King Crimson's studio records. But definitely look for more Tull content in the future. I will probably be at some point reviewing every single record. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please do subscribe to the channel. I would appreciate your support. Also, if you check the description, I have included a link to my Amazon wish list. Should you like to make a donation to the channel, I would be very much appreciated. I have also left a link to the artist who created this tapestry behind me. And I get so many comments on the stand-up tapestry, I had to try to figure out where people could order it, and you can order it online. I left a link to that in the description, as well as a link to purchase Heavy Horses, as well as my Amazon wish list. All right, That's it for me for today. It's been a lot of fun talking to you. My name's Ian Beabout, and you will hear from me real soon. Bye-bye.